Good evening, ladies and gentlemen, and you're all very welcome to the news Analysed. I'm your host, Conor Duffy. Tonight we'll be looking at Ireland in the post-recession era. Is there a wealth divide in Ireland and is it getting worse? With me here to discuss this matter is Brian Toolan, business lecturer at the Athlone Institute of Technology, and George Lee, economist and broadcaster. Tonight we find out if they agree on what it all means for our pockets. So much for the wealth of the nation, but what about the health of the nation? Keeping Ireland Alive, a recent documentary, showcased our nation's health service in never-before-seen detail. But is there room for improvement? In Studio Live, we have two Dún Laoghaire Rathdown councillors, Oisin Smith and Barry Ward, who will be discussing the issue of hospital overcrowding with me shortly. But first, Ireland's Great Wealth Divide, a documentary that was produced by Rónán Ó and presented by economist Dave McWilliams. The News Analysed visited Rónán to get his thoughts on the topic.
Rónán Ó was the producer of Ireland's Great Wealth Divide. I caught up with him one afternoon to get his opinion on wealth inequality in Ireland. So Rónán, please tell me a bit about yourself and your documentary, Wealth Inequality in Ireland.
Yes, my name is Rónán Ó. I was the executive producer of Ireland's Great Wealth Divide. It was a 1-hour documentary that we made. It was produced by Analysed Television, an independent production company for RTE. And the focus of Ireland's Great Wealth Divide was to look at, I suppose exactly what the title says, to look at the growing wealth divide that there is not only in Ireland but internationally as well. There's a lot of evidence that shows very clearly that there's a growing inequality, not only in terms of income between sort of the haves and the have-nots, but also a growing divide between when it comes to wealth. The difference being that while income is the amount of money you might earn on a monthly basis or whatever, wealth is more about the amount of money you can control or the access to wealth that you have. And the basic premise of the story is that while everybody is getting wealthier, overall when you look at all the statistics, the world is getting wealthier, there's more and more wealth being created. The top 1% are getting much wealthier, much faster. So the idea being that there's this divide growing between particularly the bottom 20% and the top 1%, and that the top 1% in fact control the vast bulk of the world's wealth.
And that was producer Rónán Ó interviewed by David Tolan. Brian, how do you feel about this report? Is there a wealth gap in Ireland? Is it getting worse?
There is a wealth gap in Ireland, but it's not necessarily getting worse, and it's not as dramatic as Dave McWilliams was trying to make out. Probably the best way to understand wealth is maybe if we think of who these people are. I was always taught that the richest people in Ireland were Sean Quinn and Tony O'Reilly, self-made guys, hard-working guys, clever guys, ambitious guys, charitable guys as well, but hard-working self-made guys who invested in the country and so on. But today, both of those gentlemen have been adjudicated bankrupt. So the idea that there's a 1% of the world that is wealthy, it's not always the same people. People who can be wealthy can lose their wealth, and people who are not wealthy can, through hard work and through effort and through luck, can become very wealthy. So it's not anyway as dramatic as I think that David tries to make out.
Okay, thank you, Brian. George, Brian suggests we shouldn't be worried about this. And there's still equal opportunity if you're prepared to work for it. Would you agree, or do we actually have something to complain about?
I don't agree that there's equal opportunity, and I don't agree that it's something we shouldn't worry about, but I would agree that you can overstate the issue in terms of the presentation of how extreme the situation is with regard to those who have and those who haven't. As I see it, wealth or inequality of wealth is a big issue. There's a huge gap before taxes and social insurance in this country between what those at the top earn and what those at the bottom earn. It's shown up in all sorts of studies from the OECD on an annual basis and otherwise. What's good about it, that's bad. What's good about it is that it does show one thing, that in Ireland in particular, our systems of taxation and social welfare are very good internationally by comparison in readjusting the gap between the rich and the poor. There's a thing called a Gini coefficient which measures inequality. On that in Europe we're one of the worst. We have one of the worst incomes inequality if you're going to go by wages. But by the time you're finished looking at taxation, and remember taxation in this country takes nearly 50% of any money you will earn over probably just below the average industrial earnings. It takes it off you, government gets it, and they distribute it in some fashion through social welfare or social spending. When you take the tax away from people and then you give some of the benefits back to other people at the lower end in terms of social insurance, you rebalance that inequality. Now, our system in this country is, by international standards, probably the best in the OECD at doing that. It means that it's actually very hard on people who are working, because we take money off people who don't have it. On €35,000, we should be taking it off people a bit more at the top, but we do distribute it. But the problem is that although we do that and we do rebalance it, we still have a great deal of inequality. To me, the biggest inequality in Ireland isn't so much in wealth net, and that is a significant issue, but it is in opportunity. And I think on that score we have a big problem. So I do believe we have an issue. I do believe you cannot ignore it. I do believe that the Irish system as it is set up has that at its heart, to try and redistribute the balance between those who have and those who have not. It's a game they will never win, but they have to keep trying. But against that, the real issue is opportunity, and I don't think that we have an equality of opportunity whatsoever. And it is important because it's important for the balance of society. The people who are at the bottom, people who have no opportunities in the beginning, how are they ever going to get above a subsistence level? And I think we all lose from that.
And Brian, how would you respond to that?
You're quite right, George. There is a progressive form of taxation. Every day, every week, every fortnight, every month, people get paid their wages. There's 2.1 million people in gainful employment in the Republic of Ireland. They pay taxes, and that taxes then goes in the form of social protection and so on. But here's the frightening bit. The amount of money that this government spent on social protection, the Department of Social Protection last year, was €20 billion. Now, what's €20 billion? I mean, I can trot that figure out. 20 billion is greater than all the tax that everybody paid in Ireland last year. We paid 19.6 billion. 20 billion was then paid out in the form of social, or into the Department of Social Protection. So every single penny that people spend on income tax goes straight to social protection. And this is what they're entitled to. Free GP care, free prescription drugs, free dental care, free back to education, social welfare payments, student grants, free travel including to Northern Ireland, household benefits, gas, electricity, free television to see George Lee.
But not everybody, everybody gets these
smokeless
things.
Fuel, carer allowances, right? There's even a Christmas bonus. Now, you're quite right to say that not everybody...
But it's a very, very extreme presentation of what people get free in this country. Most people don't get all of those things free at all.
Rich people have credit cards, right, an American Express card or whatever, but the public services card, that's worth an awful lot of money. I mean, there are people that pay €300-400
let me tell you
a month.
Exactly what the comeback should be and could be. As you say, we have a situation in Ireland where the government takes income tax and they spend more on social welfare. The problem is they don't take enough income tax off the people at the top, who are able to use all sorts of instruments of, avoidance, tax avoidance, or they locate themselves offshore for 60-50%
Okay, well, one attempt
of the
to do that was the property tax, wasn't it?
But, so there isn't enough tax to do what you're or to do the distribution, because an awful lot of people pay very, very little. Apple paid no tax anywhere. At all. So those
paid
who
income tax,
have the
they created jobs,
tiny.
They paid value-added tax, they paid, and they also paid corporate tax on earnings that were earned in Ireland. But here's an interesting one for you, right? I come with my statistics, this is an analysis of home ownership. And what's interesting about this is the richer the people are. So going from left to right, you have the poorest 10%, the richest 10%, and here are the richest people, and their houses are more expensive, if you like, or they have a greater proportion. But this is a real anomaly here. Look at this. The poorest 10% of people in Ireland own 10% of the houses. Now, the reason for this is that we have this new poor. These are the people who would have bought houses before the crash. They're overextended, and they're now in a negative equity situation. And this is the issue: is that when you target people, right? And I accept the carers' allowances and the fuel allowance are hard-won gains, right, for people who are suffering. But nevertheless, there is a scary situation going on.
Let me show you on your graph, which he has here. The poorest people own some houses. People who are elderly on social welfare pensions are poor. They own houses.
Yes.
They might have bought them when they cost very, very little, 30, 40, 50, 60 years ago. They're in your 10%.
Yes,
we're not talking about people who are at work in that 10%. A lot of them are elderly and retired, which is a different case altogether.
What I'm suggesting then is that it's a bad measure of wealth.
That's a bad measure of inequality.
But that's property assets. But that's what they were talking about. That's what David McWilliams was suggesting, was the rich are getting richer and the poor
but I don't
are
think he
not.
was talking about little old ladies who have been widowed and living in a house on a single pension of €220 a week, who is in the bottom 10% but owns a house. I don't think that's the inequality that David was trying to highlight. I personally think it was the fact that there's so much capital in the world. Capital and money is like a magnet. It attracts other money to itself, and those at the very top end up with so much. I interviewed a man on a television programme myself. He was 4 years working in Google. He came from this particular part of Dublin. He had been 4 years in London. He had his own jet, like a James Bond jet. He had his own Tesla car. He had his own Porsche car, and he was a multimillionaire after 8 years. A company which pays no tax. If a company pays no tax, they can afford to give their preferred executives enormous salaries, while the rest of us slave around and say, well, he paid the PRSI here. If you take all of the wealth out of all of the economies in the Western world and you give it into the hands of a couple of people like that, you get inequality. Not only do you get it, but you breed it, because those people become influential. They influence the decision makers in government. They say we will move our investment elsewhere if you change the tax laws, and they build a system towards themselves. The problem is how you tackle that, not how you tackle what a little old widow has in terms of her little old house and is on the bottom 10 percentile with property. To me, it's about distribution of that wealth at the top. I think we need internationalisation to tax those companies so that they can't trade one of us off against the other, and we need an equalisation of opportunity, which means investment in education opportunities in particular, and training and access to capital for people at the lower end.
I see,
the
George.
brutality of it, though, George, is that there's only one place in the world where people are truly equal, and that is Aleppo, that is Mosul. You know, that's the only place. You need capital, you need investment to be able to create wealth. Yes, I accept there is an issue with regards to the transfer of wealth, but I'm saying that it does take place. It does there. We should be proud of the fact that there is social welfare payments. We should be proud of the fact that we contribute to that, and we should be proud of the fact that we give free travel and free fuel and free gas and free electricity to your little old lady. You're absolutely
Brian, if we
right.
could stop you there, I actually have a tweet that adheres to this. It says, Mary from Donegal says, it's about time someone highlighted those social welfare cheats. Can I get your thoughts on that tweet, gentlemen?
Which social welfare cheats?
Yes.
Well, I think social welfare cheats are highlighted all the time, actually. The government produces a report every year which says we've clamped down X, Y and Z in terms of social welfare cheats. I think that is an issue which you constantly have to police any system. You've got tax cheats, you know. You've got people who are very wealthy with tax cheats.
Just, Brian, just to get your thoughts on apparently the social welfare cheats.
Yes, you're quite right. And what happens is people get angry about it. But I wouldn't want to be too obsessed with it. I mean, once you have rules, and it's nearly inherent in the Irish DNA that we just break those rules and we chance our arms. And you're right. There are people who will cheat at a corporate level, and there are people who will cheat at a basic level.
I can guarantee you they cheat a lot more.
Unfortunately, gentlemen, we have run out of time. This is a debate that could go on all day, and I thoroughly enjoyed listening to you. Thanks, gentlemen, for the most valuable discussion, and I think we've heard enough, but it's not the end of it yet. We'll see you all after the break. Now, if it's not our wealth we are worried about, it's our health. Dún Laoghaire Rathdown councillors Oisin Smith and Barry Ward are here to discuss the current bed crisis with us. But first, a short interview with Kerry Nathan, series producer on the documentary Keeping Ireland Alive.
Kerry Nathan was the producer of Keeping Ireland Alive, a documentary series capturing the Irish healthcare service in never-before-seen detail. I sat down with her to talk about her experience making the documentary series. What was your role on Keeping Ireland Alive?
So I was the series producer on Keeping Ireland Alive. So that involves really having an overview of everything going on, keeping track of all the stories that we want to, editorially the stories that we wanted to use, and basically trying to organise everything that we did. So it was quite a big role, but we had a big team, so that made it much easier.
So you stayed with the programme on every single episode. You were basically the producer for every episode. Is that correct, or would that be accurate?
Yeah. So basically, the way it works, I worked with a senior producer, and there was an executive producer involved as well. So we worked together in structuring. Basically, we had a team underneath us. We had a team of a director and producer team. I think we had 5 different director and producer teams who worked on the series, and we were helping them to sort of create and focus where we wanted the series to go editorially.
Okay. So, did you ever find a moment when you were filming or you were organising a shoot, and during the filming of the shoot, you kind of felt that, you shouldn't really be here? Like, was there ever a moment where you thought like, oh, this is a little bit too much for the people involved? Was there ever a time like that?
Yeah, so I wasn't on any of the shoots because all the shoots happened on one particular day. I was actually in the base, which was in our production office with several other people, with our lawyer, with the commissioning editor and the executive producer. But the people who were on the shoots, or people, we had different phone lines, and so they could contact us during certain points during the day. And there were issues and things that people died that day. Obviously, we were filming with the Air Corps, and we were filming in 5 different emergency departments. So I think some of the crews had difficulties in dealing with some of the things that happened that day. And I think when you're filming in a medical environment, particularly when you're filming in an emergency department and people really are seriously unwell, it is a fine line as to whether you should be there or shouldn't. So, we had to really behave very sensitively in those situations. So the crew would call us and tell us what was going on, and we'd have to make a decision whether they should actually stay there or whether they should leave.
Was there ever a time you felt very impressed by what you saw?
Very impressed?
Yes, by the actions of the doctors or by the equipment or...
Yeah, one of the things we filmed was a neurosurgeon in Beaumont Hospital, and he was removing a tumour from a spine of a guy actually who was a bus conductor, and he had a tumour in his spine. And it was the most amazing operation. It was so kind of, it was just incredible to watch. It was very visual, and you could see on the camera the tumour that he was taking out. I think it was very, very close to a nerve on the spine. So that was pretty amazing to watch.
Was that on the first episode?
Yeah.
Yes, yeah. It turned out not to be cancerous in the end.
Yeah.
Is that correct? Yes,
right.
that's the one. Yeah. No, it was fantastic. Fantastic segment.
And that was series producer Kerry Nathan, interviewed by David Toolan. Now, Oisin, every day doctors are confronted by the issue of beds or lack thereof. But how much blame do you heap on the inadequate management resources? For example, the Minister of Transportation, Shane Ross, claims it is unrealistic that the Minister for Health to be able to micromanage the bed crisis. Why is that? And why does this crisis happen at a similar time every year?
Well, I think that in Ireland we have a very high quality health service once you get into it. So once you see a doctor or a nurse, people are often very praiseworthy of the treatment that they received. But our problem is that it takes so long to actually get in. We have 500,000 people on waiting lists. When you arrive at emergency, particularly if you arrive at a busy time on a Friday evening or a Monday morning, you can be waiting for up to a day to be seen. And then once you get through the emergency department, you're often put into a corridor where you have to wait before you're admitted to the acute hospital. So we have serious problems with delays, and those delays then feed into more complicated healthcare problems. So, if our target in Ireland is that you get seen within 18 months, in other words, you see a specialist within 18 months, which is an incredibly long period of time. Like, you have a child with some kind of psychological disorder, the idea that the child will be seeing a specialist in a year and a half's time is really unacceptable. And during that time, your health can deteriorate. So what happens then is, during that year and a half you're waiting to have something simple done, a complication can develop, and then you end up going to emergency, and so you have long queues at the emergency department as well. So it's all this queuing, it's this access problem, it's the waiting, it's things going wrong while you're waiting that are causing the problem. The hospitals themselves are often, the quality is very good, the quality of care is very good.
I see.
So really we have a problem with the way that it's organised, I guess.
All right. And Barry, would you agree with Oisin's statement?
I do. I think the reality is we spend an awful lot of money, more than any other OECD country per head of capita, on our health service. Over 14 billion euros allocated last year, which is up $500 million in the year before. So the problem is not one, I think, of investment. The problem is one of organisation. And the difficulty is that, for example, when the HSE was formed, 11 regional health boards were amalgamated, not a single person was laid off. Now, the whole purpose of creating the HSE was to create economies of scale, and we haven't done that. So you have a situation where, at whatever level, there are people who clearly are not necessary and maybe are not achieving the economies and the efficiencies within the system that we need. But she makes a good point as well about the throughput of the system. You go into an emergency department and you're processed and triaged and all the rest, and then you're admitted to hospital. There must then be space in the hospital to deal with you. And what we need to do is make sure that there's a throughput in the hospital, so that when people have been treated and are in recovery, they're not occupying, for example, an intensive care bed or a bed that is in a high dependency unit, that they're moved into maybe a step down facility or something else, so that there can continue to be that throughput of patients as they move through the different phases of their treatment.
I see.
So Barry's right. I mean, you have a problem where there aren't enough nursing homes, there aren't enough step-down care. So somebody who's been treated in the acute hospital, they're better, they're well enough to be discharged, but they've nowhere to go because it's an older person who's living alone, and they need somebody, perhaps they need somebody at home to look after them, perhaps they need to move into some kind of step-down care facility where they'll be looked after a bit before they go back to their house, or perhaps they need to move to a nursing home. And it's those places, because they're not available, that's why people are waiting in the emergency department. And the confusion for the public sometimes is to believe that we just need bigger emergency departments, whereas the problem might lie at the other end.
I see. That is a good point. But Barry, is the bed crisis solely to blame on a strain of incompetence in the HSC? Or is it possible that so-called trespassing patients who are unwilling to leave a hospital bed but no longer require care, do they play a role in this crisis?
I'm very uncomfortable with the term trespassing patients. I don't think that's a fair or reasonable term to use, but it is a term that has been used obviously by certain quarters, and I don't condone it. Nevertheless, it is possible to identify patients who don't need to be in a bed that they're in, which is not their fault. Obviously, it's the system that isn't working. And talking about that point that Oisín is using, for example, a post-operative patient who maybe needs time to recovery does not need to be in the post-op ward necessarily for days, but can be there immediately after the operation and thereafter be moved to a step-down facility where there is the care that that person requires, but it's not in an acute hospital surrounding maybe where there is a much greater demand for services. So if we have a situation where you have those after-care or after treatment facilities like nursing homes, like step-down facilities, you can have a situation where you don't have that blockage at one end of the system. And again, it's not the patient's fault because very few patients want to stay in hospital for a prolonged period of time. Most patients want to get home. It's not always possible to do that. So what the system needs to do is create the circumstances that allow that person to move on to the next phase in a way that maintains the level of treatment that they require, but also frees up the acute facilities and the facilities on which there is such a huge demand.
Okay, and Oisín, would you agree with Barry's statement?
Absolutely, yeah. But I think we can stand back from this debate about how do we deal with so many people coming to hospital? How do we process them all? As if we're, there's often a view that we're looking at something which is like a factory. We're looking at a process of things going in, and the ideal vision then is that our hospital treats thousands and thousands of people. That there are lots of operations. Everybody's getting their treatment and so on. And stand back and say, is there any way that we can stop people from arriving at the hospital in the first place? In other words, can we make the healthcare system more about health and less about sickness? Because really all of the resources of the healthcare system seem to be focused on treating people once they've become sick, rather than focusing anything on helping them to prevent them becoming sick in the first place. And we're councillors in Dún Laoghaire. We don't get to run the hospitals, we don't get to run the healthcare service, but we do design the cities that may lead to particular healthcare outcomes. So for example, if we design schools and towns and districts that that require you to drive to get everywhere, that mean that children can't safely walk or cycle to school, that means those kids may end up requiring cardiac care at a later stage. So really the question is, can we get away from a view of the healthcare system as being all about sickness and say, what about making it actually about healthy living? Can we do something preventive? Can we do something that's actually more cost effective with the money rather than looking always at this kind of medical answer to people who are already sick?
Indeed, Oisín, that is a fair point. I have a few tweets here now, guys. Deborah from Galway tweets, the healthcare service is underfinanced and understaffed. It's time for an update. Would you two agree with that statement?
No. I wouldn't. It's not underfinanced and it's not understaffed. However, I think it's a legitimate criticism to say that the distribution of staff is wrong, that we maybe have too many people in administration and not enough in frontline care. But it is not underfunded. As I said at the very beginning, we spend more per head of capita on our health service than any other OECD country. So the reality is that the funding is there, the staff are there, but I think it's fair to say that they could be distributed differently so that you have more nurses, more doctors, more medical staff, more people who are actually dealing with patients, the patient-facing side of the business. That could definitely be ameliorated.
I have another tweet here from Nathan from Carlow. He tweets, the Irish health service is one of the best in the world. Just be happy you're not in a developing country. What would you think, Oisín?
I think you have to consider how much money we put into our healthcare service and what we get out at the end of the day.
Indeed.
Our healthcare services, compared to other European countries, it's roughly about halfway. But we spend an awful lot of money to get there, so we're not really getting bang for our buck. I think that's one of the problems.
I mean, we should always be grateful we're not in a developing country.
That's true.
But it is all relative, and if we are spending the kind of money that we're talking about, you expect to be getting the results and the turnout at the end of the system.
We should be comparing ourselves with Denmark or Germany and not with Botswana or Uganda.
Indeed, correct. This is another tweet that continues along similar lines. Derek from Tipperary tweets, why are beds always a problem? Just invest more into the system. And beds seem to be the go-to crisis for the health service in Ireland.
Investing more into the system, part of the result of that is to create more capacity, and capacity is beds. If you want to have an operation, you need the theatre, you need the staff, but you also need the bed to deal with the person before the operation and after the operation. If you don't have that, you can't avail of the facilities that are there, because Irish hospitals can be very, very well equipped, but if you don't have the capacity to bring people through to avail of that equipment and avail of the expertise that our medical personnel have, then you don't have the throughput of people, and you don't have the same number of treatments that you could achieve from the same facilities.
Indeed. And you always do hear the horror stories about people being left on trolleys overnight and such. Oisin, what are your thoughts? Do we need more beds, or is it, as Barry says, just the management system needs to be tightened up?
Yeah, I think beds are a very simple idea. A bed is a pretty cheap thing, but you need all the support staff. You need all the equipment. It's incredibly expensive to provide a ward. It's not the cost of the building itself. It's not the cost of the beds. It's the cost of all the staff. As I said, I believe that we actually spend enough on the healthcare system, and that money is not the problem. I think we need to do something about preventing people from becoming sick. I think we need to keep our population healthier for longer, rather than just trying to create a situation where everybody gets sick and everybody gets treated.
I see.
Progress is being made in that direction. Like, the prevention is better than cure maxim is tremendously important. And for example, recent schemes in terms of screening for bowel cancer, for breast cancer, for cervical cancer, they have been tremendously successful in achieving results bit by bit over the last couple of years. But the Trinity Longitudinal Age Study has shown that this week that actually we are achieving results in terms of preventing, in terms of oncology. A lot of cancers are being detected at a stage when they can be much more easily treated, and the prognosis from treating them is much more successful as well.
And one more tweet, gentlemen, just to finish on a positive note. James from Offaly tweets, I never had any trouble with the health service, even when I went in to get my appendix removed. So that's a positive note anyway.
Yeah, I think that if you speak to people who've managed to get to hospital, they're often very happy with what happened. They're on an emotional level, they feel that the person really helped them, really looked after them and nursed them back to health. So it's not, once you get in there, you're okay. It's all the waiting.
I think as well there's a qualitative difference between somebody with appendicitis and somebody maybe with a chronic, non-urgent case. Like we've heard, for example, cases of people with scoliosis, osteoporosis, things like that, who maybe don't need immediate care, but definitely in the short term do need ongoing care, and they are perhaps, because of emergency cases, being put to the back of the line, and that's not fair on them either.
And just on a final note, gentlemen, if you could do one thing to improve the health service, what would you be? Oisin, your thoughts first?
I would look at prevention rather than cure. So I would be looking at trying to direct resources towards making people healthier, particularly problems with heart disease and respiratory illness. We are way up compared to other European countries for those problems, and those problems are related to inactivity. They're related to diet.
Sorry, Oisin, we're just running out of time. For you, Barry,
Yeah,
one quick note?
that's great, but I think we need to increase frontline staff so that we can have more throughput.
Okay, thank you very much, Barry. That was a great contribution to the debate, gentlemen. The health service is a very complex Byzantine structure, and perhaps tonight we have shone a light on it. We will be back next week to highlight more topics and help analyse the news. Good night.